from Now Is Your Time by Walter Dean Myers. Selection illustrated by Stephen Noble. James Forten was born in Philadelphia in 1766 and grew up during the American Revolution. He overcame great obstacles to become one of the most important African Americans of his time. Thomas Forten, a free African, was employed by Robert Bridges, a sailmaker in Philadelphia. Sailmaking was a profitable but difficult job. Sewing the coarse cloth was brutal on the hands. The heavy thread had to be waxed and handled with dexterity. A person trying to break the thread with his hands could see it cut through his flesh like a knife. But Forten appreciated his job. It paid reasonably well, and the work was steady. Forten's helped in all aspects of sailmaking and assisted in installing the sails on the ships the firm serviced. With the income from his work, he had purchased his wife's freedom. Now, on this early Tuesday morning, a new baby was due. The baby, born later that day, was James Forten. Young James Forten's early life was not that different from that of other poor children living in Philadelphia. He played marbles and blind man's buff, and he raced in the streets. When he was old enough, he would go down to the docks to see the ships. Sometimes James went to the shop where his father worked and did odd jobs. Bridges liked him and let him work as much as he could, but he also encouraged Thomas Forten to make sure that his son learned to read and write. The Fortens sent their son to the small school that had been created for African children by a Quaker, Anthony Benezet. He believed that the only way the Africans would ever take a meaningful place in the colonies would be through education. Thomas Forten was working on a ship when he fell to his death. James Forten was only 7 at the time. His mother was devastated, but still insisted that her son continue school. He did so for 2 more years, after which he took a job working in a small store. What James wanted to do was go to sea. He was 14 in 1781 when his mother finally relented and gave her permission. America was fighting for its freedom, and James Forten would be fighting too. He knew about the difficulties between the British and the American colonists. He had seen first British soldiers and then American soldiers marching through the streets of Philadelphia. Among the American soldiers were men of color. A black child in Philadelphia in the 1700s had to be careful. There were stories of free Africans being kidnapped and sold into slavery. He had seen the captives on the ships. They looked like him, the same dark skin, the same wide nose, but there was a sadness about them that both touched his heart and frightened him. He had seen Africans in chains being marched through the streets on their way to the South. He never forgot the sight of his people in bondage, or accepting it as natural that black people should be slaves. But the black soldiers Forten saw were something special. Marching with muskets on their shoulders, they seemed taller and blacker than any men he had ever seen. And there were African sailors, too. He knew some of these men. They had been fishermen and haulers before the conflict with Great Britain. Now they worked on privateers and navy ships. Sometimes he heard talk about naval battles, and he tried to imagine what they must have been like. In the summer of 1781, James Forten signed on to the privateer Royal Louis, commanded by Stephen Decatur Sr. The colonies had few ships of their own to fight against the powerful British Navy, and issued letters of marque to private parties. These allowed the ships, under the flag of the United States, to attack British ships and to profit from the sale of any vessel captured. The Royal Louis sailed out of Philadelphia in August and was quickly engaged by the British vessel Active, a heavy armed brig sent from England to protect its trade ships. The Royal Louis's guns were loaded with gunpowder that was tamped down by an assistant gunner. Then the cannonball was put into the barrel and pushed against the powder. Then the powder would be ignited. The powder had to be kept below decks in case of a hit by an enemy ship. Philadelphia Harbor, as it appeared around the time the Royal Louis defeated the Active. Forten's job was to carry the gunpowder from below to the guns. Up and down the stairs he raced with the powder, as shots from the British ship whistled overhead. There were large holes in the sails, and men screaming as they were hit with grape shot that splintered the sides of the ship. The smell of gunpowder filled the air as Captain Decatur turned his ship to keep his broadside guns trained on the active. Sailors all about Forten were falling, some dying even as others cried for more powder. Again he went below decks, knowing that if a shot ripped through the powder kegs, or if any of the burning planks fell down into the hold, he would be killed instantly in the explosion. Up he came again with as much powder as he could carry. After what must have seemed forever, with the two ships tacking about each other like angry cats, the Active lowered its flag. It had surrendered. Decatur brought his ship into Philadelphia, its guns still trained on the limping Active. The crowd on the dock cheered wildly as they recognized the American flag on the Royal Louis. On board the victorious ship, James Forten had mixed feelings, as he saw so many of his comrades wounded, some mortally. The Royal Louis turned its prisoners over to military authorities. On the 27th of September, the Active was sold. The proceeds were split among the owners of the Royal Louis and the crew. The sailors with the worst wounds were sent off to be cared for. The others, their own wounds treated, were soon about the business of repairing the ship. Forten must have been excited. Once the fear of the battle had subsided and the wounded were taken off, it was easy to think about the dangerous encounter in terms of adventure. And they had won. The missing crew was replaced. The ship was checked carefully by its captain and found to be in fine fighting condition. The crew carried more ammunition aboard, more powder, and fresh provisions. Once more they sailed for open waters. On the 16th of October, 1781, they sighted a ship, recognized it as British, and made for it instantly. As they neared, a second ship was spotted, and then a third. Decatur turned to escape the trap, but it was already too late. The three British ships, the Amphion, the Nymph, and the sloop Pomona, closed in. It was soon clear that the Royal Louis had two choices, to surrender or to be sunk. The Royal Louis lowered its flag. It had surrendered, and its crew were now prisoners. Forten was terrified. He had heard the stories of the British sending captured Africans to the West Indies to be sold into slavery. He knew the Pomona had sailed back and forth from the colonies to the island of Barbados, where many Africans already languished in bondage. It was a time for dread. The notorious British prison ship Jersey, which was docked off Long Island, New York. James was taken aboard the Amphion with others from his crew. On board, the British ship Captain Beasley inspected the prisoners. There were several boys among the American crew, and he separated them from the older men. Captain Beasley's son looked over the boys who had been captured. Many of them were younger than he was. Although still prisoners, the boys were given more freedom than the men, and Beasley's son saw the Americans playing marbles. He joined in the game, and it was during this playing that he befriended Forten. The result of this tentative friendship was that Captain Beasley did not, as he might have done, send Forten to a ship bound for the West Indies and slavery. Instead, he was treated as a regular prisoner of war and sent to the prison ship, the Jersey. Dark and forbidding, the Jersey was a 60-gunner anchored off Long Island in New York. It had been too old to use in the war and had been refitted first as a hospital ship and then as a ship for prisoners. The portholes had been sealed and 20-inch squares carved into her sides. Across these squares, iron bars were placed. The captain of the Jersey greeted all the prisoners with a sneer. All were searched under the watchful eye of British Marines. The wounded were unattended, the sick ignored. The pitiful cries of other prisoners came from below decks. A few pale, sickly prisoners, covered with sores, were huddled around a water cask. Then came the cry that some would hear for months, others for years. "Down, rebels, down!" They were rebels against the king, to be despised, perhaps to be hanged. Traitors, they were being called, not soldiers of America. James was pushed into a line on deck. The line shuffled toward the water cask, where each man could fill a canteen with a pint of water. Then they were pushed roughly below decks. The hold of the ship was dark. What little light there was came from the small squares along the hull. The air was dank. Some of the prisoners were moaning. Others manned pumps to remove the water from the bottom of the boat. Sleep was hard coming, and James wasn't sure if he wouldn't still be sold into slavery. Beasley's son had liked him, he remembered, and the boy had offered to persuade his father to take James to England. It would have been better than the hold of the Jersey. In the morning, the first thing the crew did was to check to see how many prisoners had died during the night. Many of the prisoners were sick with yellow fever, for these deaths would be just a matter of time. Forten later claimed that the game of marbles with Beasley's son had saved him from a life of slavery in the West Indies, but on November 1st, 2 weeks after the capture of the Royal Louis, the news reached New York that Brigadier General Charles Cornwallis had surrendered to George Washington. Washington had strongly protested the British practice of sending prisoners to the West Indies. It was probably the news of his victory, more than the game of marbles, that saved the young sailor. An unknown artist probably painted this watercolor portrait of Forten during his lifetime. James Forten was not a hero. He did not single-handedly defeat the British or sink a ship, but he fought, like so many other Africans, for the freedom of America, and he fought well. He was only one of thousands of Africans who helped to create the country known as the United States of America. In Philadelphia, after the war, James Forten became an apprentice to the man his father had worked for, Robert Bridges. Like his father, James was a hard worker. Eventually, he would run the business for Robert Bridges, and by 1798, he owned it. At its height, the business employed 40 workers, both black and white. Forten became one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. He married and raised a family, passing on to them the values of hard work he had learned from his father. Forten made several major contributions to the sailmaking business, among them a method of handling the huge sails in a shop, which allowed sails to be repaired much faster and saved precious time for ship owners. In the coming years, he would use his great wealth to support both anti-slavery groups and the right of women to vote, at a time when over 90% of all Africans in America were still in a state of enslavement. James Forten became one of the most influential of the African abolitionists. He spent much of his life pleading for the freedom of his people and the country his people had helped to create.